Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. Thank you so much for tuning in to the first day of the online edit of the 13th Annual Mumbai International Literature Festival that you are so fond of. This year, in its special combined format, we have 2 days of the online edits of the festival, today and tomorrow. And then for those in and around Mumbai, remember, you can join us for the physical version of the festival at NCPA on Friday, November 11th, Saturday, November 12th, and Sunday, November 13th. And at the St. Paul's Institute and the bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra, on Saturday and Sunday. Log on to tatalitlive.in to check out our schedule and speakers. I'll be there, so I'll be looking forward to seeing you all there too. Now, on to our fourth and final online session for today. Truth or Dare, the future of investigative journalism. Our panelist today, Mr. John Pilger, says, journalists can help people by telling the truth or by as much truth as they can find, and acting not as agents of governments of power, but of people. That is real journalism. The rest is specious and false. Leading us forth today into what he thinks is the future of investigative journalism, we welcome our first speaker for today. Mr. John Pilger is an internationally renowned, multiple award-winning investigative journalist, documentary filmmaker, as well as a scholar. He has received human rights awards and journalism awards, as well as honorary doctorates. He has twice been named Britain's Journalist of the Year, and his documentaries have received Academy Awards in Britain and the United States. In conversation with him today will be Ms. Geeta Seshu. Mumbai-based Geeta Seshu was once principal correspondent of the Indian Express. Today, she lectures on the media at several universities and is engaged in issues concerning freedom of expression, working conditions of journalists, gender, and civil liberties. She was the editor of Soul Curry, an internet portal for women, and of the niche social issues magazine, Humanscape. Please remember, you can contribute to our question answer session at the end of the session, but you can send in your questions right through the session. Write in your questions in the comment boxes of the platform you're viewing us on at any time through the session. And do remember to write in your names as well. So, over to you, Mr. Pilger and Ms. Seshu, to play Truth or Dare, the future of investigative journalism.
Greetings and welcome to this session, Truth or Dare, the future of investigative journalism. Though it is at the core of journalism, investigative journalism is struggling to be heard in the midst of a very high decibel noise of disinformation, fake news, and propaganda. Today, more than ever, journalists are being attacked, they are thrown behind bars, they grapple with litigation for several years, field reporters are killed. Governments, big business, dominant media maintain a stranglehold on news. What will it take for journalists to continue to inform the public and hold these powers accountable? For over 65 years, John Pilger has been doing just that. From the trenches in Vietnam, Cambodia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, he has written about the NHS, he's investigated the deaths of children due to thalidomide, spoken out for the recognition of indigenous Australians. His articles, books, documentaries, and films, 60 of them, bear very powerful and visceral witness to violence and injustice, most of it hidden from this world. John Pilger, we are so glad to have you for this session.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
I'd like to begin with asking you about what is the main issue really that the world is seeing today. Apart from your war reportage, you've written extensively about the media's role in shaping public opinion, the good war, the good side. Afghanistan was described as this war on terror, and also a war of perception. Iraq was, as this film you've made shows us, the war you don't see. But this is the age of social media, and there is so much information about what is called the propaganda war in Ukraine. What do you think we are missing?
Well, I think we're missing real information. We're getting a lot of repetitive information, what I would call media noise. I mean, that's always been the case. We've just got so many more outlets now. But the majority of information that people get on their phone, they probably know already, or it is repetitive of some particular line that commercial interests, governments, and their vested interests are trying to pursue. So we have the illusion of an information society, but in fact, we have a media society, and that media is very controlled. And you spoke about the journalists who have been killed and brutalized, and indeed, you're absolutely right, all over the world. That's become almost a hazard of going into the field as a war correspondent now, that you might well be killed by your own side. But I think what isn't really understood is the quiet intimidation of journalists. As journalists in India know, there is an intimidation. Should we do this? Should we write?
Yes.
Who is that person standing at the back of the hall listening to my lecture? Who has come to listen to my documentary film? I don't recognize that person. Now, nothing may happen, but I have many friends in India, and I know the kind of intimidation that they go through. That doesn't mean to say that they're killed or even arrested.
Correct.
But their work and what they do, their lives, and no doubt their loved ones, are affected by this. And that's something we should be talking rather more about, I think. If not more about, we should be giving it the legitimacy that the frontline reporter in danger has. Now, there are problems with frontline reporters. They can be embedded, as we've seen in war after war.
That's right.
And we have now the reporting, at least in the West, I have to say, and the West, and to a great degree from what I've seen in India, but mainly in the West, a tsunami of jingoistic nonsense that is put down as journalism. And I've never known anything like it in war reporting, as a complete one-sidedness. Either you declare yourself completely on one side, or you become some kind of pariah, certainly a renegade. These are matters that aren't discussed.
Sorry. You're absolutely right about the kind of, self-censorship that we are seeing in journalists in mainstream media, especially journalists who are not allowed to write. Very little of this is actually documented because it's very difficult to get people to speak out and say that they've had to self-censor. But what we're also seeing is journalism which is being criminalized. In India, we have about 8 media persons in custody. You've spoken out very strongly about Julian Assange, and he spent 11 years unfree, charged with espionage. And these are the kind of charges that journalists are being thrown at, because we have national security, conspiracies, all these kind of charges, which are almost impossible for journalists to secure bail, and even defend themselves. So how do you think we can protect journalists from this sort of penal action?
Well, it varies greatly from country to country. You know, it is unusual in this country, in Britain, for a journalist to be made into such an obvious political object of political persecution as Julian Assange is. It's become almost a parody, the case of itself. It's so grotesque. But you know that in India, and I don't intend to name anybody, there are journalists who have found themselves stuck in the court system, or their publications have, or those associated with them have, that have the prosecution of them has an ulterior motive. It's a political prosecution. It may not say so, but it is. Now, it doesn't say here that Julian Assange is being politically prosecuted, although the extradition laws, the extradition treaty between the United States and Britain, which should cover Julian Assange's case, is a political treaty. And his example is so outrageous, it's almost as if something has changed dramatically, something that was always there beneath the surface. The intimidation I was speaking about, perhaps prevalent in India, very prevalent in this country and in the United States at different levels. That has changed into something rather hard-edged.
So, it's almost as if they are, there's a chilling effect being, brought in by setting an example with Assange. Yes.
It's the Assange effect. The Assange effect, you will begin to keep it in the back of your mind. It used to be in this country, I can remember making films and reporting during the war in Northern Ireland. There was the island effect. Now, there are many draconian hurdles, laws that stopped you doing that, intimidating you. So you kept in your mind the Irish effect on my work if I set out on this. The same is true with Julian. It's often said that Julian's case really threatens the whole notion of a free press. But that assumes that we have a free press, and we don't have a free press. We have a monopolized press that speaks with one voice, as we've seen in the reporting of a major event like the Ukraine war. But there are, and there's long been in Britain, the United States, India, other countries, a tradition of great maverick journalists. I can't think of another word but maverick. That is, people who are prepared to go against the system and be journalists. I don't even like the term investigative journalist. I mean, if you're a journalist, you investigate. Otherwise, what do you do? Well, you don't do a lot. But
very correct. Yes.
Yeah. So it's those journalists that have always kept the system, given the system a measure of legitimacy and honesty. They are really at risk. I know that since I began in journalism, the spaces that were always there within the mainstream free media closed. They no longer exist. I no longer work for, let's say, a mainstream newspaper. I've worked for many years for The Guardian. That ended. It won't begin again, I know. So that kind of isolation of journalists is very much a feature of today.
Which actually is, very disturbing, because apart from the kind of penal action, what we observe here in India, and I don't, you could tell me what it's like there, but when journalists do really good investigative work, they are ignored. And much of their work is actually not given any regard. The journalists itself are their journalistic aspect of their work is disregarded in many ways. Much of their good work is therefore killed because governments just refuse to respond and hold themselves accountable.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's almost a recent tactic, the refusal to respond. Now, in the past, there was a response. It may have been an angry response, or some or other, but there was a response. Now the work is passed over. The journalist will find himself or herself isolated, often, but the work is passed over. Why is this so? Well, because real journalists are a threat. And they've written it down on paper. About 10 years ago, WikiLeaks leaked a wonderful document from the Ministry of Defense here about how to stop leaks. So WikiLeaks got hold of it, of course, and it was about the three major threats to honesty, to reporting the national security state. And they were, 1, Russian spies, 2, terrorists, but at the top of the list were journalists, investigative journalists.
Okay.
That is, the Mavericks we were speaking about. It's wonderful to be so honored by these people, but it can be difficult at the time.
But there are other threats really journalists are facing. I mean, we've had the Pegasus revelations and the more recent tussle between Facebook and the India-based news site, The Wire, which tells us about the huge danger of surveillance, the planting of electronic evidence. So how do journalists, firewall themselves from these kind of threats?
Well, again, I think it varies from case to case. You have to be prepared to take risks, and taking the risk of being ensnarled by your government, by any government. We now have the Assange effect. Here is Julian, an Australian national in Britain, publishing material, and yet the United States has this extrajudicial reach, it seems, always, that it can bring about this prosecution that could end up with him spending the rest of his life in an American hellhole. So there are risks. The answer to that, there are risks to be taken. I must admit, I used to always have in the back of my mind the very strict libel laws in Britain. And indeed, I have been sued a number of times, and once I was sued once by the government, disastrously. But so that was a risk I was aware of. But if I was doing the same body of work now, I'd have to have another whole
Set of risks.
set of risks, and some of them would be very ill-defined. You wouldn't be sure about them. Now, the problem with that then engenders a certain paranoia. One is only human. You start looking over your shoulder. But there are very fine journalists who are doing work that do reveal what the public has a right to know. That's what all this is about. It's about public service. What Julian Assange did was perform an extraordinary public service. He tells the public what their government, when their government is lying. And here's the evidence in their own words. It's authentic. It's not supposition. And that's real journalism.
You've talked a lot about the pitfalls of this notion of objectivity and impartiality, neutrality. But today we are seeing, journalists who are very shockingly partisan and quite shamelessly support very authoritarian governments. So how does one deal with that, and how do we distinguish this kind of partisan journalism from the more balanced, but not partial, but truthful journalism?
Yeah, well, it's a very, goes to the heart of the matter there. But I mean, whenever I've talked about that, what I've done is criticize the whole, or try to identify the device used by governments and those who speak for governments as they appropriate the notion of balance, of objectivity and subjectivity. Now, in fact, they've always been. War reporting, for example, by embedded journalists has always been subjective on the side of the particular government that has agreed to embed them. But they go along with this fiction. And the best of that is the BBC. We have in this country the most refined propaganda organization on earth, where they give us from time to time, they and their people give us these charming little lectures about how objective they are, and how the moment they enter the BBC, they rise to a nirvana of balance, and that they couldn't possibly, it'd be like another organ being taken out if they gave an opinion. Well, that is ridiculous. The BBC is possibly the most subjective and certainly the most, it is the voice of establishment in this country, as other great broadcasting institutions throughout the world are, but perhaps without the same pretension. So that's what I was speaking of now. Now they don't care, many of them. They are so much of media doesn't make any pretense of being objective, of even giving a token voice to the other side. Almost nothing I read, see, or hear about the war in Ukraine, I'm prepared to believe unless I deconstruct it. And that's what I would advise people to do. But people don't have the time sitting in front of a television set, turn on the news and deconstruct what they're watching. But they have to do that because none of it is to be trusted. None of the sources are to be trusted. In the past, there were particular people you could identify that you trusted, or sources that you trusted. I don't think there are now. So I think what you're describing is people are being much more open, in a sense, in their partiality, much more, almost proud to be it.
That's so in one sense, that polarization is useful because, you know, we know where we stand when we see somebody or we hear someone. But the other issue that I think really that I'd like to ask you about is the kind of budget cuts that big media houses have for news gathering. So more and more journalists are out of formal employment. And, you know, there is funding, there are fund crunches, of course, and good journalism is sometimes behind a paywall. So, and we also have to depend so much on social media platforms to amplify stories. So how, you know, you have moved away really, because you made your documentaries, you made your videos much before the internet, much before multimedia journalism was such a big thing. How do you see, you know, journalism being reinvented to be more accessible for people?
The principles of good journalism haven't changed. The technology has been changing dramatically all through my career. Yes, it's particularly dramatic, I suppose, in the last few years, but really, communications, revolution in communications began when I was just starting out in journalism. So, but what hasn't changed and what must not change are the principles of journalism. You know, the technology, it's only a tool where so often they try to, I suppose those who regard tech in a kind of saintly way almost try to say it's not just a means, it is the end as well. Well, it's not. It's merely another means. And it's a matter of getting as much truth as you possibly can. You can't get it all. And putting it into a report and giving it to as many people as you can. Journalism is very basic. Good journalism, that's what it is. Now, you may be presented with a lot of practical problems to try and achieve that, but the nature of the problem hasn't changed. There always were governments trying to stop honest journalists telling the truth about them, always. Going back, I mean, the last British war, and God knows there have been many of them, the last one that was reported honestly was the Crimea in the mid-19th century. When William Howard Russell of the Times disclosed the disaster of the charge of the Light Brigade, and was Queen Victoria wanted to put him and his editor up for on charges of treason. Through the First World War, we're still having Hollywood movies about the First World War, the Slaughterfest. Journalists agreed not to tell the truth, and later wrote in their memoirs that they agreed not to tell the truth. And for agreeing not to tell the truth, they were knighted. And so the point I'm making is that basically nothing has changed. There is still the truth to tell, and how you tell it, well, it's always going to be difficult. Whether it's more difficult now, I don't know. There's greater monopoly now ownership of the media. There's no question about that. I mean, in the early 1980s, there were something like 50 companies throughout the world that controlled most of the world's major media. Now, that's not many, but now there are something like 4. And then you add to that the great leviathans of Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it. So monopoly is a problem. But, you know, monopoly is a problem. I started on a newspaper owned by a man in Australia who was probably the most right-wing person in the world, I think. I think he, but I learned about how you did it. But so the problem, the barriers were always there.
In your own words, you've said you're an inveterate film fan, but you've been really scathing about Hollywood, which you call this babbling brook. Do you have any favorites, any personal favorites, any films that are personal favorites?
Of films, yeah, I have many. My memory will now fail me completely, I'm sure. Well, as a matter of fact, I saw again last night a film with a very simple title, one-word title of Good. Good was a film, a German film made with English actors.
Okay.
And forgive me, I've forgotten the name of the actors, but it was about the slow seduction of an academic through the 30s and during the war, a very, very liberal academic during the Nazi period. Now, I hasten to say we've had enough, in my opinion, of films about the Nazi period. But perhaps it says we've had enough of a certain kind of film. We haven't seen the sort of subversion that applies to morality and to ourselves today. And this very much does. It's about this one academic. It's an absolutely fine film, and I'm going to watch it. I'm going to watch it a third time. So I often do that with films I like.
Okay. I was watching this interview you conducted with Sean McBride, The Outsiders.
It's a long time ago.
And you asked him this question, if he sees himself as an outsider.
Yeah.
If I can ask you the same question today, do you see yourself as an outsider? How do you see yourself?
I was hoping he would say yes, because the series was called The Outsiders.
Right, that's right.
But yes, outside establishment and undemocratic, unaccountable authority. Those two words are very, very important. Undemocratic and unaccountable, unrepresentative authority. I'm an outsider, most certainly. I'm also an outsider, I suppose now, in journalism, though I never used to regard myself as that, because journalism, like everything else, has shifted from being, let's say, a bystander on the sidelines, sometimes taking other unfortunate views, but has shifted way in the political spectrum, way over to the right, and is now represents it now represents one very confined political way of thinking. So I'm an outsider there, yeah. But, you know, if perhaps you have to be a good journalist to be an outsider. Otherwise, there are jobs for journalists, for filmmakers, for academics, for writers, for all of us in the service of great power. It's not who you are; it's who you serve, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, so how do we find ways to keep connecting to people? I mean, apart from just using journalism as tools, what other ways do you think we can find to keep telling those stories, to keep putting the stories out?
Well, I think it's about perseverance. Many governments are at war with their own people.
Mhm.
In this country, the government is at war with its own people. In India, the government is at war with its own people. A country that has, in 2022, most of the world's hungry still today, when the solutions to that have been made very, very clear, comes down to a government at war with its own people. In India, a government at war with its agricultural people. That's very clear, with its children. I remember the last literary festival in Mumbai I attended and very much enjoyed. But I was always struck by this wonderful elite event where people were debating and discussing at such a high standard, and yet across the road there is, outside the Centre for Performing Arts, there's a big banyan tree, and there was a whole family living in that tree. Perhaps I hadn't been to India for a couple of years, but you know, while that situation exists, and in this country we've just had the funeral of the Queen, a massive event, as everyone knows, but the people now living on the streets of London, not all that far from Buckingham Palace, has increased and is going to increase even more. Now, if we have the solutions that stop that happening, doesn't happen because of some divine providence that the people are suddenly thrown into this situation. It's happened because of extreme ideologies that become the authority in the land, that don't represent all people. I think I don't know whether you wanted a non-political answer to your question.
No, not at all.
Everything has a political answer.
Absolutely. Yeah, because we also see a lot of big business, which has entered the media in India, especially, and is controlling a lot of the information flow, apart from, shaping public opinion, because there is no information really for the public to be able to get any kind of formulate any sort of opinions. So, and that's pretty much everywhere in the media.
Yeah.
Sponsorship, fundings.
But the media is important for keeping the illusion going of a democracy. I mean, I think, what is there, over 3 million democratically elected representatives in India. And yet there still, since 1947, there still is not the structure of a system of social and economic justice. Why is that? It's a question that it absolutely begs answering. So there are plenty of people with being elected here and there, as there are in this country. But how did we end up with this pantomime that's going on at the moment in London, where the victims of it are going to be large numbers of people who will be forced to endure a policy of so-called austerity?
Yes. We have some questions from the audience here. And one of them actually is exactly what you're asking. I mean, what do you say? What do you think about social media as a force in democracy? This comes from Vijay Lakshmi Narayan. And how would you look at this, social media?
Well, yeah, I mean, but most social media is just used for trivia. It isn't used properly, but then most media is used for trivia. But basically, as a vehicle for keeping in touch with, it has shown itself, for example, in places where there have been upheaval and a successful people's movement. There have been examples where Facebook, for example, in being as a means of people contacting each other and sharing ideas, has played a positive role, yes. But most of the time, it doesn't. People use it, and perhaps many people want to use it that way, they want to share their personal lives, or it's a vehicle of trivia. I don't see it as a vehicle of democracy at the moment. It could be.
Okay, yes. And most often now it's actually working against democracy in many ways.
Yes.
Especially with the kind of censorship we're seeing. There's a question here which is really interesting. It comes from K. Arumugam. It says, what is your reaction to critics who say your documentary, The Coming War on China, has been soft on the authoritarian regime in China?
I would say nonsense.
Okay.
They haven't watched it. That's what I would say. Two things. Yeah. It's anyone who watches it will show that that's just nonsense. So they haven't watched it.
Okay, but there's another follow-up question, which is similar, I think, from Bibek Chatterjee. It says, some critics will agree with your criticism of the subtle and not so subtle intimidation of journalists in Western democracies, but say you're not half as critical of authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, where we don't know what's happening.
Well, I think, look, I think our responsibility first is to be critical of our own governments, our own countries, and we are not. It's the other way around. The enemies, the official enemies, Russia, China, Iran, you know, all those enemies that now and then an American president will call the axis of evil or something or other. We are licensed to be critical of them, but we are never truly critical of ourselves. That's what our discussion has really been about. Of looking in the mirror is something that we rarely do. And I would ask those people, when are you truly critical of your own government in what they're doing in relation perhaps to those countries? And once a journalist has fulfilled that responsibility,
Mhm.
being at least equally critical of his own country, his own government, then he has some right to be as critical of other countries, but certainly not to parrot his own government's views of so-called enemies.
Well, in this jingoistic atmosphere, it's very difficult to do that. I mean, it's almost a crime. Of course, it's a crime. But there are two other questions which are from Tahira Hussain. She wants to know what was your most physically dangerous assignment?
I always regard the most dangerous assignments are those when I fear I'm up against an employer, an editor who won't publish my work. Look, there've been many physically dangerous, but there are too many journalists talking about the dangerous lives they lead, and I can't really think of one at the moment.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually. Was there any story you think you could have done differently or revisited?
Yes, probably most of them done differently. Well, yeah. It is such an imperfect, everything you do is so imperfect. And you have an aim. And if you don't achieve that aim in time, I've spent a lot of my life working against the clock. And so the clock has become the enemy. To finish something that is not superficial, that is substantial, that is truthful, to do it in time. And I'm sure, as occasionally I've done, looking back on what I've written, all I can say is I wish I'd had more time, or I wish I'd spent more on that. So, yeah, it's you don't finish something and say, there it is, another wonderful example of my brilliance. No, quite the opposite. You feel very insecure about whether your work will live up to the standard you yourself place on it.
We have one last question. Which journalist do you admire when you were starting out, and why? This is from Gaurav Sathe.
Yes, well, Wilfred Burchett was one. Wilfred Burchett was a famous Australian journalist who worked for the Daily Express in London, who was the first person to report the effects of Hiroshima. He got Hiroshima. And I have on my wall over there his front page from 1945, which says the atomic plague. And up to that point, and we've talked earlier about how governments deceive their readers, the Allies in Japan were saying that there was no radioactivity, at least it wasn't a danger to the people in Hiroshima, that those who died had died from the impact. and he showed that that was false. And he did that by defying governments, taking risks, risking his life. So he's in that series you quoted, The Outsiders, a true outsider.
Yes, I remember your documentary, Tell Me No Lies.
Yes, he's in that too. Yeah.
There's so many more issues we could discuss, but unfortunately, we're really at the end of our session. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and for continuing to inspire generations of journalists. Thank you so much, John Pilger. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pilger and Ms. Seshu, for that amazingly eye-opening conversation. And a huge thanks to you, our loyal and dedicated audience, for joining us today online. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the full list of sessions and speakers, because we have so many more exciting sessions lined up for you, both online and offline. Like our next session today at 10 p.m. is Sense and Census, How Demographics Underpin Global Transformations, where Dr. Paul Moreland chats with Rukmini S. And for those of you in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for our exciting offline festival as part of the physical on-ground sessions that kick off on Friday, November 11th at the NCPA, and through Saturday 12th and Sunday 13th at the NCPA, and also at St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves Bookstore on Saturday and Sunday, featuring authors and ideologues such as Gitanjali Shri, Manu Pillai, Naushad Forbes, David Polonsky, Nandita Haksar, and Ashwin Sangvi, among so many other fantastic writers, journalists, and poets. Thanks for tuning into Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks. That concludes our online session for today, but continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where you can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good night.